Yes, very good afternoon. Ralf Kampöne from Eurocommerce, representing wholesalers, retailers, import-export traders in the European Union and beyond. Now it's too late to commend the Commissioner actually on what he has achieved last month in Bali on trade facilitation, the World Trade Organization, but I think that's a comment that I would nonetheless like to make very much, and link that with a question to the panel, to those remaining on the panel, actually, because it must mean something also to you, because we heard that the economic beneficial impact of that agreement in Bali would be 1 trillion euros, so that's tremendous. So I would be very keen to hear any sort of personal views or views of your constituencies. And secondly, what's next for the World Trade Organization in your view? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. So that trade facilitation deal, as you say, heralded at the time as an enormous breakthrough. Please, sir.
Yes. Well, I'm taking again the floor. I'm González Quijano. I'm representing the European leather industry. And I would like to comment one thing, a comment that made Commissioner de Gucht. He said that it's about opening markets. It's about opening markets, and he said it clearly that we need to export, but we need also to source. It's not only about opening markets for selling our products, but it's also about getting the raw materials that we need to add the European value added and to re-export or to produce it within the European Union. That's fundamental. And that is probably one of the points, Commissioner, you asked us to be outspoken, and this is probably one of the major points where we need to be working on. Okay. Opening access to raw materials. And if I may, it's not only about making agreements, free trade agreements, but also about enforcing the rights that these trade agreements give to industry. And there is a case, for instance, Morocco has for 10 years infringed the bilateral agreement with the European Union to the detriment of industry.
So we need implementation, we need enforcement, otherwise none of these agreements amount to much. Please, sir.
Thanks. Wolfgang Weber from BASF. I guess we are all agreeing today that indeed the TTIP and other FTAs bring many, many opportunities, be that for raw materials or for tariffs in general or for non-tariff barriers. The question is, the Commissioner has already said that indeed there is concern that the thing might derail in some public debates in the Parliament now, in particular if we think about the investor-to-state dispute settlement agreements that are under discussion. So what can we do as industry together to outreach even more to the public and to tell them that that many of the concerns are really not justified and that the benefits are also to consumers? I think we still need to find more on that one.
Okay, I'm going to come back because we don't have that long and quite diverse questions, so it'll take a time to pick up on them all. WTO trade facilitation deal, but more broadly, what's next for the WTO was the key question there. This question of access to raw materials and what you do about restrictions, export restrictions and so on, I think probably something you'll want to touch on, John, and public awareness, public acceptance that these things matter. John, resource diplomacy, is that what you'd like to pick up on?
I thought the example from the gentleman in the leather industry was important. I was looking at a product that we sell in Europe, and I went back through the supply chain, and the box came from Vietnam, the bottle came from Mexico, the corn came from the US, and some of the distillation was done in Canada. And having, with our interconnected supply chains in this world, having easy access at competitive prices to those resources is absolutely essential. So it isn't just the demand side of the business, it is the supply side that's critical.
The Commissioner's had a raw materials strategy for a number of years now. Is it effective? Is our resource diplomacy, are we punching our weight in terms of resource diplomacy, or do you think there needs to be even greater focus on
well,
this?
Obviously, in that instance, there's an issue. In most instances in my industry, it is okay, but I think things like the horse meat scandal last year certainly show in the food and drink industry that could change at any moment, and legislation and regulation could come in that could be for the right reasons, but with the wrong impact. And on the other point on the voice of business, yeah, I do think the voice of business has been too light on this type of issue in the past few years in Europe. And I would commend Business Europe in putting this conference together. I think it's great to have this type of forum to speak more clearly, and each of us in our own industry should take on that accountability to help get the ball over the line on some of these critical free trade agreements.
So a job for politicians, but also for business. On WTO facilitation or any of the other issues, Peter first, yeah.
Well, just to try to briefly answer all three. First, the trade facilitation agreement is, in fact, it's very important. It's very critical. I think it could be one of those agreements that does more for the developing countries than they think it will do. The clear, easy movement of goods between borders is usually good for the competitiveness of the importing country. And I think it was good that both the commissioner and the gentleman from the Leather Society also emphasized the importance of imports as a matter of competitiveness, not just as a matter of good things. Our trade policy in both the United States and Europe tends to be very low on barriers to imports, relatively speaking. We have a lot of places where we could do better. But it's all the more reason why an aggressive trade policy overseas is important. For the transatlantic agreement, the customs facilitation aspect of trade in goods could be truly ambitious and truly world-class, go way beyond what is being talked about in terms of the WTO. And this is, again, where I think business needs to be super engaged to actually tell officials how you can make a very smooth supply chain across borders in terms of a single electronic portal and things of that nature. Mentioned on imports, Wolfgang, to your comment. First, I think the commissioner was absolutely correct to say it's not enough for business to speak out in favor of agreement after an agreement is concluded, just in the ratification phase. It's time for the business sector, I think all of us, to be speaking to our publics about the role of business in the world, how business creates jobs, how business needs access to broad markets in order to do that, and how we intend to do things to essentially take away people's fears. I tend to think that businessmen by nature they're emissaries of hope. You don't go into business if you don't think you're going to win. And you're always trying hard to win. That's an incredibly positive message, even just there, that's not discussed enough. But when we talk to the public, we need to think about the words we use.
Okay.
Non-tariff barrier, in the context of a transatlantic agreement, please don't use it. Because our regulators believe that the regulations that they've adopted to protect our people, to protect the environment, to protect our investors, our workers, are justified regulations. It's not a non-tariff barrier to trade.
Okay, so it's the language we use.
The question is, how do you bridge between them? And I think that's an important thing to think about.
Okay, thank you. Pierre-Alain, on this question, and perhaps looking, if you can, a little bit crystal ball in terms of the future of the World Trade Organization. Many people saying a couple of years ago couldn't get agreement on anything. Now this very significant deal, as we've heard. What do you see as the future for it, alongside all these bilateral deals that are now being done?
Well, again, I consider that is an absolute must. I was impressed because I know lots of those negotiations which are running, also the agreements which were made last year, but the list that was made by the Commissioner is just impressive on what has been done and what is about to be done this year and in the very next years. So again, and he told us an important figure, it covers now about 70% of the external trade of Europe. Now, again, I consider, and I was explaining, how important exports and trade are. This has been said many times today for our European economy. And the third question which was raised for me, and that was my first remark, is extremely important. It is about saying trade for Europe, for jobs, for people themselves, is a win-win operation. And so we need to make much more advertising publicity about what is being done and what the results for the daily life of people will be. Just on the TTIP, we say, Well, it's 400,000 jobs which are at stake. It's 0.5% of the GDP, which could grow more. So we absolutely need, just as the commissioner was saying, to speak more, we as a business community to tell that to the people so that they know Europe is not only bad news, it's also good news.
So Emma said right at the beginning of today, we need to deliver some messages loud and clear. This is one area where you think the business community can play a greater role, but also in terms of what the Commissioner was saying, do you think I don't know whether it was meant as a criticism, but I took it as a criticism, when he said, if you don't tell us what the problems are, we can't solve them. We need your help more. I took that to mean he felt he wasn't getting it, but you've talked about the public side. Just briefly before we draw some conclusions, on the input into the policy side, do you think there is more that businesses should be doing, perhaps in raising, I think he was suggesting, the really practical problems you face, rather than the big picture of the trade agreement? Pierre-Alain, do you think he had a point? Was he, I don't know whether he was being critical or not, but could the business community do more?